we can debunk a myth, and the myth says our attention span is shorter. Our attention span is not shorter. You don't even have to work in neuroscience to know this. All you have to do is be very honest with yourself and the world when somebody asks, what's the longest amount of hours you have binge watched on a TV show?
Have you ever caught yourself saying, I just can't focus like I used to? Or maybe you've heard someone else say it. My attention span is terrible. I can't read books anymore. My brain has been destroyed by social media. It's become one of those things that almost everyone accepts as true. But honestly, sometimes it feels true. But then something doesn't quite add up. The same people who say they can't focus anymore will watch an entire football game without checking their phone, or you'll binge 4 hours of a Netflix series on a Sunday afternoon. Maybe they'll listen to a 3-hour podcast on a road trip. So I've been wondering, what exactly has changed? Have our brains really lost the ability to pay attention? Or are we misunderstanding attention altogether? So I became obsessed with this question because I realized it sits underneath almost everything I teach. Before someone trusts your idea, they have to notice it. Before they remember your presentation, they have to pay attention. Before they even recommend you, hire you, or finish reading your email, your brain has to make one incredibly small but powerful decision. This is worth paying attention to. And that tiny decision may be one of the most important moments in all of influence. So today I want to explore what science actually says about attention. We'll talk about brain rot. We'll talk about whether attention spans are really shrinking. And I'll share one study to completely change how I think about social media. And towards the end, I'll show you 7 principles that can help you direct people's attention more effectively, whether you're trying to land a meeting or give a presentation or creating content or simply trying to get one idea heard. Because I have a suspicion, maybe influence doesn't begin with persuading someone. It begins with attention. Let me start with something you've probably heard dozens of times. Humans have now a shorter attention span than a goldfish. It's one of those facts that's been used everywhere. In TED Talks, corporate presentations, news articles, marketing conferences. I personally probably heard it 100 times. The funny thing is, a few years ago, people started to ask a simple question. Where did that statistic actually come from? And that's where the story gets interesting. Researchers and journalists tried tracing the original source. They followed citation after citation. Eventually, it hit a dead end. The evidence behind one of the most famous statements about attention didn't actually exist. The statement had been simply repeated enough times that it became accepted as fact. I love stories like this because it reminds us how easily our brains confuse familiarity with truth. The more often we hear something, the more believable it starts to sound. Behavioral scientists call this the illusory truth effect. It's a tendency to believe that a statement is a fact simply because you've heard it multiple times. It's a good reminder that repetition can influence belief, even when the original claim is weak. But discovering the goldfish myth raised a bigger question for me. If one of the most important facts about attention wasn't really a fact, then what do scientists actually believe? One thing I didn't appreciate until I started reading the research is that psychologists don't really talk about attention span the way the rest of us do. It's actually a pretty fuzzy term. Imagine someone asking, are people less athletic than they used to be? Well, what does that even mean? Do they mean strength, speed, balance, endurance, flexibility? You probably need to be much more specific. Attention works the same way. There isn't one single mental system that we can point to and call it attention. Researchers study sustained attention, selective attention, working memory, inhibitory control, prospective memory. They're all related, but they're not identical. And that changed how I thought about the entire conversation. Maybe asking whether our attention spans are shrinking is like asking whether people are becoming less healthy. It's probably too broad a question. And once I realized that, another question started to feel more interesting. Instead of asking whether our brains are broken, how does the brain decide what deserves attention in the first place? Because if we can answer that, we've answered something much bigger than whether TikTok is making us distracted. We've answered one of the most important questions in influence and leadership. How do people decide what's worth listening to? Before we get into the neuroscience, I want you to think about the last meeting you attended. Not the oddball meeting, but the average meeting. How long did it take before someone looked at their phone? Maybe it was you. Maybe it was 30 seconds. Maybe it was 5 minutes. Now, here's the question I've been wrestling with. Were people distracted because they couldn't pay attention, or because their brains quietly decided that something else deserved the attention? You see, that distinction I think matters a lot, because once you understand how the brain makes that decision, you start seeing attention everywhere. You also start realizing that the most influential people aren't necessarily the smartest people in the room. They're often the people who understand how to guide everyone else's attention. So, what is attention, really? The more papers I read, the more I realize something. Scientists rarely define attention the way we do. Most of us think of attention as the ability to focus, almost like it's a muscle. Some people have more of it, some people have less of it. But when psychologists study attention, they spend surprisingly little time asking how long someone can focus. Instead, they're interested in something more fundamental. Why does your brain notice one thing and completely ignore thousands of others? Take a second to look around the room you're in. Really look. Notice the colors of the walls, the objects sitting on your desk, the sounds around you, maybe the feeling of your feet on the floor or your shoes. Now, ask yourself, were those things already there 30 seconds ago? Well, of course they were. Your brain simply decided they weren't important enough to bring into your awareness. And that fascinates me, because every second your senses are collecting an enormous amount of information. Billions of bits, far more than your conscious mind could ever process. If your brain tried to pay attention to everything, every movement, every conversation, every notification, every smell, you'll never get anything done. And so attention isn't simply about noticing things. It's about filtering. It's deciding what's allowed through the front door. So while everything else stays quiet on the outside, you start thinking about one thing. And so when I started thinking about this way, something clicked. Maybe the challenge is not about whether leaders can help people with attention. Maybe it's about whether leaders can help those who follow them focus on the right things. Your brain is constantly playing defense. Think about your average workday. Your inbox is filling up, Slack notifications are popping, your phone is vibrating, someone walks past your office. You remember you forgot to send an email. You think about dinner, and maybe your child texts you. All of those things are competing for exactly the same resource, your attention. And only one of them gets to win, which means your presentation is not competing against another presentation. Your LinkedIn post is not competing with another LinkedIn post. Your sales pitch isn't competing with another salesperson. It's competing against everything that's happening inside someone's mind. And that's a much tougher job than most of us realize. So what does the brain actually pay attention to? To answer this question, I looked back at my notes, gathered from neuroscience papers, marketing research, my podcast episodes, and some studies looked at attention, others looked at persuasion, some studied advertising. But when I look across all of them, at first they seem unrelated. But after a while, I noticed a pattern. The same ideas kept showing up. Different researchers, different experiments, yet they were pointing towards the same handful of things. It reminded me of this quote: when independent studies keep arriving at similar conclusions, it's usually worth paying attention. So I started asking myself a simple question. If the brain decides what to pay attention to, what signals does it use? I think there are 7. These are not hacks or tricks. They're simply the things the brain has evolved to notice, because at one point, noticing helped us survive. So let's walk through them. The first is relevance. Imagine you're walking through an airport. Hundreds of conversations, announcements over the speakers, rolling suitcases, background music. Then suddenly, someone says your name. You hear it instantly. Even from across the room, you turn towards that sound. Nothing about your hearing suddenly improved, but your brain recognized something that mattered to you. And that's what attention does. It constantly asks, does this matter to me? And if the answer is no, it moves on. And that's why so many presentations lose people before they even start. We begin introducing ourselves, talking about our company, explaining our background. Meanwhile, the audience is sitting there quietly asking themselves, why should I care? That's not selfish. That's efficient. The brain is trying to decide whether this information deserves its limited resources. And one of the simplest ways to become more influential is to answer that question immediately. Don't start with you. begin with the problem your audience recognizes. The moment people see themselves in your message, attention follows. The second is novelty. The brain loves to predict. It is a prediction engine, and most of the time is trying to anticipate what happens next. That's incredibly efficient. If you've driven to work 100 times, you don't consciously analyze every stop sign. Your brain predicts. It fills in the blanks. But prediction has an interesting side effect. Whenever reality doesn't match the prediction, attention spikes. That's why when someone drops a glass in a restaurant, immediately everyone turns their head. And that's why headlines like these work. Scientists discovered, or everything we thought about X is wrong. The brain notices surprises because surprises might matter. Now, here's where I think a lot of experts make mistakes. They assume novelty means being outrageous. No, it doesn't. Sometimes novelty is just presenting a familiar idea in an unfamiliar angle. For example, when Apple launched the MP3 player years ago, instead of talking about gigabytes, they said 1,000 songs in your pocket. The product didn't change. It wasn't outrageous. They simply presented it in a new way. The third is consequences. Imagine someone walks into your office and says, "When you have a chance, I'll love your opinion on something." You might get to that later. But imagine now they say, "We have a client who's about to make $1 million decision and something important just happened." Whoa, everything changes. It's the same person in the same office, but different stakes. Attention naturally follows consequences. And that's why loss aversion is one of the strongest findings in behavioral science. Our brains are generally more sensitive to potential losses than equivalent gains. It's why headlines about mistakes, risks, or missed opportunities, they all outperform headlines about best practices because people care about losses. They're evolved to prioritize information that could protect us. And great leaders understand this. They don't create the panic, but they do help people understand why something matters right now. Let me pause here for a second. Before we get to the next 4 patterns for grabbing attention, I have a question for you, a simple question. Have you ever noticed that some people naturally influence others through stories, while others rely on data and evidence? Some people immediately seek to build rapport, while others lead with a specific action. Throughout the years of working with leaders, I found that we all have default patterns when it comes to influence. And that's exactly why I built the Influence Style Assessment. More than 900 leaders have already taken it. In about 3 minutes, you'll discover your natural influence style profile, the strengths that come with it, and the blind spots that might be limiting your impact without you even realizing this. It's completely free. There's only 16 questions. So if you enjoy this episode, I will think you will sincerely enjoy the assessment. You'll find the link in the description below, and if you're listening, also in the show notes. Now, let's come back to attention because the next 4 principles are the ones that I use almost every single day when I'm writing, speaking, leading workshops, presenting. So far, we've talked about 3 things that naturally capture your attention: relevance, novelty, and consequences. There are 4 more patterns that I see over and over again. And these are the 4 that I probably use the most. So here we go. Number 4, emotion. Let's imagine I ask you to remember this sentence. Employees were significantly more likely to stay after their manager regularly recognized their contributions. Now, imagine I told you this instead. There was one employee who said they got a new job offer with a higher pay. But then during the day, there was a meeting whom they thought was ordinary. But the manager looked them in the eye and said, "I don't think you realize how important you have been to this team." That person turned down the offer and stayed. Which one are you more likely to pay attention to, and which one will you remember? Probably the story. Because emotions act like a highlighter for the brain. When something makes us laugh, makes us cry, makes us anxious, makes us have hope, our brain says this, this feels important. I should pay attention, and maybe I should save this. That's one reason why stories have survived for thousands of years in how we communicate, long before PowerPoint decks, long before books and podcasts and writing. Stories were how human beings passed along information that mattered. Whether I'm talking, whether I'm giving a keynote, I want to think about this. How do I want people to feel? Because feeling determines whether they'll lean in and listen and whether they'll come back for the next one. Number 5, curiosity. Curiosity might be my favorite one of them all, mostly because it's impossible to ignore once you notice it. Think about your favorite mystery movie. Within the first few minutes, something happens that doesn't quite make sense. Someone disappears, a strange phone call, an unopened letter. You immediately start asking questions. Who did it? Why? What's going to happen next? The movie doesn't answer those questions immediately. It lets your brain do the work, and that's curiosity. It's a gap between what you know and what you want to know. The psychologist George Lowenstein calls this the information gap. Once the brain notices missing information, it naturally wants to close that gap. I think our experts answer questions too quickly. We rush to the solution. We explain. We teach. We dump information. But sometimes the better approach is to let people become curious first. So instead of saying, I'm going to teach you 7 ways to build trust, you might begin with, I spent years wondering why some leaders inspire trust almost instantly, while others seem to never earn it. Eventually, I found one pattern that kept appearing in the research. Now people lean in because you have given their brain something to look forward to, a gap that they want to close. That's curiosity. Number 6, simplicity. Now here's something I wish more experts understood. Complexity doesn't signal intelligence. Clarity and simplicity does. You know, I used to think that the smartest people out there were the ones with the most impressive vocabulary, the ones who use really big words. But now I think the opposite. The smartest people are the ones who can actually communicate complicated ideas in a very simple and obvious way, because that's much harder. Researchers have found that our brains naturally prefer things that are easier to process. And psychologists sometimes call this processing fluency. Daniel Oppenheimer, a professor of psychology, did a series of experiments about this. And one of my favorite ones was taking difficult academic writing and rewriting using simpler words while preserving the meaning. Participants then evaluated the different versions, and the result, simpler versions were rated consistently as better written, and the authors were actually judged as more intelligent. So when something feels easy to understand, we're more likely to believe it, more likely to remember it, and more likely to actually act on it. That's one reason why analogies work so well. So whenever you're communicating, think about this. It's not about whether you can sound more impressive. It's really about how can I make this easier to understand? And those are very, very different goals. Last but not least, identity. This might be the most powerful of them all. You see, human beings don't simply make decisions. We make decisions that are consistent with who we believe we are or who we would like to become. Think about the difference between saying you should exercise more and saying you're the kind of person who follows through on commitments. One talks about behavior, but the other speaks to identity. And identity captures attention because it answers one of the deepest questions every human being carries around. What kind of person am I? That's why great leaders don't assign tasks. They remind people of who they already are. You're an engineer, you're a caregiver, you're a craftsman, and you, a professional of influence. You have an identity, and the identity gives behavior meaning. And it holds attention far longer and far better than simple instructions ever will. So now let's step back. We've talked about these 7 patterns: relevance, novelty, consequences, emotion, curiosity, simplicity, and identity. You notice something that's interesting? None of this required to speak louder. They're not about clickbaiting. They're not manipulation. They're simply the reflections of how the brains evolved to notice something. And once you see this, you begin to notice them everywhere. Why certain presentations hold the room, why certain headlines stop your scroll, why certain leaders or experts can hold the attention of a room. A lot of communication, a lot of what's being taught out there is about how do you persuade someone? How do you get someone to buy into an idea? But before that can even happen, the first step is to be able to guide someone to focus their attention on whatever you're communicating. That's the key And that's the essence to influence, because if you can't grab and hold someone's attention, your idea will never reach the ears and mind of the people you wish to influence. There's a quote from the pioneering psychologist William James that I've been thinking about throughout this episode. He wrote, "My experience is what I agree to attend to." I've been wondering what that means for us today, because maybe attention isn't just about shaping what we notice, it's about shaping who we become. Think about your own life, the books you've read, the conversations you've had, the podcasts you're listening to, the videos that you watch, the ideas you return to again and again and again. You see, those moments not just shape your thinking, they shape who you are. And they all began the same way. You paid attention. So perhaps one of the most important questions we can ask ourselves isn't just about how do I get more people's attention? It's what am I helping people pay attention to? Because that's the responsibility that comes with influence. If you're fortunate enough to have someone's attention, even for a few minutes, you have an opportunity to shape how they see the world and who they become. And that's a privilege, and one I think we should use very carefully. From Spider-Man, Uncle Ben says this best: with great power comes great responsibility. And now the responsibility is in your hands. If you're an expert who wants to use psychology and behavioral science to be more successful in your work and in life, make sure to subscribe. Every week, I explore the science behind how we make decisions, why some people and some ideas get noticed while others don't, and how leaders can become more visible, more memorable, and have more influence. And if you got thinking and your wheels are turning after today, you have to watch my conversation with Dr. Carmen Simon. We talk about what happens after you earn attention. How do you make your ideas unforgettable? If you're watching this right now on YouTube, you can click on the link right here. And if you're listening on a podcast, go look for Carmen's episode. It's called The Only 10% That Matters. And I believe it was published June 23rd. I will see you there. Let's go meet Carmen.